I was born into the old Africa. And for me, that Africa has an image that I know some of you have in your heads, but at the end of this talk, I'm hoping to show you an image of a new Africa. The story of my birth began on May 2nd, 1971, when a young Justina Anyaka chose to marry her high school sweetheart. See, at that point, the civil war in Nigeria just ended. And for a lot of people, getting away from the village, getting away from those communities where the war was hardest felt, was an escape, was also a way to get away from their past, but more critically, it was a way to seek out a new economic future. And for Justina, she did just that. Along with her husband, she left the village and moved out to the city. And when she got to the city, she embraced entrepreneurship. And I'm proud to say that she was the first entrepreneur I ever knew. See, in that time, Justina and her husband built a new life in the city, and through many encounters and opportunities, went ahead and forged that life. And like good Catholics, they had a lot of children. And in this time, like many other Nigerians, they would go back to the village to visit with their families, connect with childhood friends, and participate in local community activities. Later, in the 70s, a heavily pregnant Justina, 5 children in, and against all of the advice of her doctor, she went to the village, of course, to see her family. And on Christmas Day, her water broke. No medical care in sight. Justina had this baby on Christmas Day on a dirt road right there in the village. That child is standing in front of you today. And the story of my birth and the story of Justina leaving that village is casting that first boomerang. Now pay attention to that boomerang. It might come back to you. See, being born in the village in Nigeria was my first foray into the world, but I moved back to the city with my parents, got a great education, and had the opportunity to emigrate to the United States. And I joined a legion of diasporans in the United States. But in being here, remember, I was born in that old Africa. So I still had interactions with what that old Africa used to be. And some of those images of that old Africa were not particularly images that I was in agreement with. The old Africa was known for its strife. And within these stories of the old Africa, yes, I put out the caveat, Africa is not a monolith, right? It's 55 countries, is over 1 billion people. So for some of these pockets of the continent where this pain and anguish is actually felt, I stand before you today to say that that concentration is decreasing. It's not all perfect yet, but it's better than it ever was, and it's certainly better than it was in my 4 decades on Earth. And you find that when I joined this prestigious diaspora club, and I came out here and sought a better life for myself, I cast my boomerang. And my boomerang left, and it allowed me to get educated and work in wonderful places, travel the world. But this diaspora population that I became a part of was also growing. And I looked at that population and I remembered that entrepreneur who gave birth to me, and my entrepreneur zeal started kicking in. It kicked in because I took elements of my education to find a better job and to give back to the communities that birthed me. But it also kicked in because this community itself created such a great pipeline for this new Africa that I'm pushing forth to tap into. The US Census data shows that the diaspora population in the US, the African diaspora population in the US, has grown from about 80,000 people in 1970 to about 2.1 million as of the last census in 2015. And this represents about 4.8% of the total foreign-born population. So when I speak about this new Africa, and I speak about this activity that we're bringing forth, the new Africa that I paint has 3 main actors who are going to be critical to its success. The first actor, I want to call him the expat. And not expert, but the expat, and it's short for expatriate. See, the expatriate was born here in the US. I see some of them in the audience. And for some of you, born here in the US, strong African roots, you read it in the papers, you follow it on Facebook, but that connection is there because you have extended cousins, extended relatives, and you have that connection to the continent. And you keep telling yourself that at some point, you will get back there and you will do some work. So the expat is foreign-born, but with very strong connections to the continent. The repat, like me, was born on the continent. So he's repatriated because he came out, and she came out, to the US or to the West, gained education, gained a better life, but is always going back. That boomerang goes full swing. You're always going back. You're going to do work there. You're going to do projects there. You're going back to family and friends. And you're going back to join this legion that you left behind, and the legion that has actually created such a good foundation that you're incentivized to actually go back. And then there are the globalists, the folks who are not even African, but who recognize Africa's role in the global economy. See, these folks, like many of you in the room, are looking at Africa and looking at that new continent. They're looking at a continent that used to be branded in a variety of ways. At some point, it's Africa rising. At some point, it's a dark continent. You never really know, right? But when you're playing in this global space and you recognize the macroeconomic policies, activities, and directions, you would see that Africa is a remarkable opportunity. So this expat, this repat, and the globalist. And they're all coming together in a very interesting collision course, because the one particular element that they're going to amplify is the Afropreneur. See, I belong to the school of thought that says Africa's economic future will be built on entrepreneurship. And we've chosen to brand that entrepreneur an Afropreneur because we want to localize it and because we want to have that conversation built on African talent, resources, and unique African solutions. So in this case, we have an expat, we have a repat, we have an entrepreneur, and back in that continent, we have the Afropreneur, who stayed back even when the repats left, who's there to welcome the expats when they get back, and who's the token unit for all of the globalists to come in and see what she has done. And we're proud of these Afropreneurs. We know that they are the future, and we know that they're going to be the unit of Africa's success leading into the 21st century and beyond. In the now famous movie, Coming to America, Eddie Murphy once said he believed the children are the future. I believe that the African children are the future. And in this new Africa that we're painting, a lot of these children are children of the internet. The old Africa had a lot of strife and pain. But this new Africa, in this new generation of knowledge economies, even after Africa skipped so many industrial revolutions, are now born into this new knowledge economy where, with the power of the internet and the power of a mobile phone, you have all the information at your fingertips. And for many of these African children, whether they're facing a new code, a new software code that they want to write and learn how to program, or they're just on YouTube learning a new song or taking a new class, the internet and the mobile economy have now become critical tools for Africa's economic future. And a lot of these young kids, including my kids, are now becoming direct beneficiaries of this. Because for every village in Africa where you have a phone, for every city in Africa where you have mobile connectivity, and for every institution in Africa where self-directed learning is the path forward, you're looking at the next generation of leaders in Africa. Because they will seize that opportunity, they will take that initiative, and they will build that economy on their own terms. But I talked about this larger entrepreneurial activity. I talked about this Afropreneur. And I'm very fortunate. See, a day in the life for me includes talking to a lot of African entrepreneurs and guiding them through elements of their business, developing their businesses, seeking capital, seeking partnerships. We run quite a number of programs on the African continent to advance entrepreneurial activity. And in a given year, I talk to hundreds of entrepreneurs, and I meet with a lot of change makers. Now, I mentioned the internet, but these are all not digital entrepreneurs. A lot of these entrepreneurs are social entrepreneurs. They're not just solving technology problems, they're creating impact and solving those billion problems in a billion population economy. Clean water, energy, education, gender empowerment, but they're doing it on African terms. And they're doing it with local resources that point to how it should be done. It's not copy-paste from the West. It's localizing, it's contextualizing, and it's allowing for these next generation change makers to make sure that the Afropreneur creates Africa-centric solutions. And we find that we're very fortunate in the way that we've designed these as well. Because I left the continent, came out here, sought a better life for myself, but I was also specific about how much I wanted to give back. And when my boomerang took flight and came back to the continent of my birth, entrepreneurship was one of the ways I could give back. But there are a lot of things that are constraints to that system. There are infrastructure challenges. There's talent challenges. In some cases, capital for some of these entrepreneurs to scale. And in some cases, it's the lack of basic formal education that will drive this new 21st century job. And we're very, very intentional about the way we go about this. And that's why this combination of the expat, the repat, and the globalist becomes that critical tool that we know will advance Africa's future. So if you are an expat, if you were born here and you were thinking about Africa, and your passion for the continent is on a Twitter feed, or it's on a Facebook post, or it's on one of those church programs that has you go into the continent for a few days and come out. Well, I want you to think about Africa now and see the opportunity. The economic opportunity, the level of youth ingenuity, and the technologies that would allow you to participate in a continent that is thriving. If you are a repat, like me, and you came out of the continent in its darkest times, and you were looking for this new opportunity here, and then you're now hearing, it's just filtering out there, how in Kenya, M-Pesa is allowing people to pay through SMS. Well, guess what, folks? That's been going on for 10 years now. Way before Apple got Apple Pay. Way before you could do the smart googly things. Market women in Kenya have been making payments via SMS. So for us repats, sometimes we need to stay connected, and we must. We have a responsibility to. But in staying connected to some of these technology innovations, in staying connected to see how much impact we could give, we need to stay connected to the Afropreneur. We need to reach back out, and we need to make sure that some of the knowledge gaps that she has, some of the intellectual gaps that he has, are things that we can provide because our boomerang has taken flight and is returned. And if you are that globalist, if you have that passion for Africa, if you own one of these shirts in your closet, I want to call you out today and say, hey, here's what you need to do for me. Look around you, find an expat, find a repat, and get on a plane with one of them to Africa. Because at this point, it's no longer about what you can say about your African passion, it's about what you can do. And the Africa that I speak about, this new Africa, it's open for business. It's thriving. So this is not one of those sappy Africa stories. Not at all. There's great business to be done there. There are great entrepreneurs coming out of there. There are great expats that have passion to give back. And there are great repats that are willing to take that knowledge and give it back. The brain drain that was the bane of Africa's existence in the 80s is now a reverse brain drain that's becoming a fuel for the 21st century. So I urge each one of you to look at your personal boomerang and see when it's going to take flight. Is it going to be an expat? Is it going to be a repat? or is it going to be a globalist? And for that first boomerang I spoke about, Justina, her boomerang took flight in Ihiala, Nigeria. And she just became a US citizen about 3 weeks ago, so her boomerang's currently floating in Morgan Hill, California. That's my Africa. That's the Africa that I see. That's the Africa that I'm rebooting. And that's the Africa that I'm welcoming you to join me on this journey, because the only way is up. Thank you.